Greetings, everybody. Welcome to another exciting lecture by your favorite speaker, Dr. Ronald J. Brown. Our topic for today is something that's very important for me because having grown up in a small town, Pennsylvania, and then traveled around the world, I finally settled in the early 1990s here in New York City. So New York has been my home. In fact, for many years, I worked as a licensed New York City tour guide. I teach New York history. I even developed a course in the history of New York for Touro University, where I have been teaching for many years. So this is a topic that I'm very, very interested in, not just the history, but also where is New York City going to be in 10, 20, or even 100 years? Is it going to be a pile of rubble like we see when we go to the ancient ruins of ancient cities in Europe or around the world? Or is it going to continuously reinvent itself and remain the Empire City well into the future? So let's get started. Once again, this is our outline, how New York became known as the Empire City. Not just another dumpy little town somewhere. From the very beginning, it has had an image of itself as a great city. Secondly, building the Empire City. Not just an idea, but it takes form in concrete and steel and glass and plastic. The other side of New York City, Sodom on the Hudson, city considered by many to be the height of glorious architecture and art and music, but also the pit of pornography and depravity. Well, the New York experience has been one of confronting challenges and fighting back. The Empire City leads the world. It is still a major city. What about the challenges of the 21st century? How is it going to confront them? And finally, New York's diverse visions of the future. What is going to be our role in the future? Not everybody agrees. There are a lot of competing visions of New York in the future. So, why don't we get going and explore the future of New York City? Well, New York City emerged, of course, it was called New Amsterdam, already with a certain identity. If you look at the map on the left, you see the yellow part, which was the Dutch claim, which includes everything up to Connecticut, New York City, New York State, up to the great rivers of Canada, the St. Lawrence, well into the west, including all of Pennsylvania, all of New Jersey, even claiming the green areas, which would be most of New Hampshire and Delaware. Long Island, as you can see, is pink. That was the British part. But half of Long Island was Dutch, where we get towns like Flushing, Vlissingen, and the other half was English. So New Amsterdam, as we see it on the right, as it looked in following its establishment in 1624, was the capital of a giant empire. And it was also the capital of the lands claimed and occupied by the Dutch in the Atlantic Ocean, which included islands in the Caribbean, at times huge chunks of Brazil, and Dutch colonies in Africa. So New Amsterdam was a city of consequence from the very beginning. On the right, you see the wall going up and down. That's Wall Street. To the right and to the left, that big street, that is today Broadway. On the left-hand side, you see Fort Amsterdam to protect the colony from invaders. And in front of the fort, we see that little rectangular park. That is Bowling Green, the oldest park in the city at the very foot of Broadway. So from the very beginning, New Amsterdam was more than a refuge for a bunch of crazy Quakers, such as Philadelphia, or equally crazy Puritans, as was Boston, or as a gang of renegade Catholics, as was Baltimore. It was an empire city from the very beginning. Well, the Dutch tried to keep their colony, but eventually the English, who were established up in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and New Hampshire, and the English, who were well established in Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas, decided that they didn't want this Dutch enclave separating the colonies. So in 1664, the English Navy sailed into New York Harbor and told old Peter Stuyvesant, the governor, you see his picture on the left with his peg leg, telling him, well, you either surrender or we will burn New Amsterdam to the ground and expel all the Dutch. Well, Peter Stuyvesant wanted to refuse and wanted to fight back. But everybody else in the colony, which was already diverse with Jews and with African Americans and Indians and Germans and French and Scots and Irish and Spanish, and everybody else was living in this colony in addition to a handful of Dutchmen. So Peter Stuyvesant was forced to surrender. Well, this, in the eyes of many people, such as Diedrich Knickerbocker on the right, claimed that this was one of the most important events in the history of the colonies. Because with the English takeover of New Amsterdam, carving out colonies of New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, the 13 colonies emerged. And according to Washington Irving, it was because of the Dutch losing New Amsterdam and the English gaining it, a continuous group of 13 colonies emerged. And the 13 colonies became eventually what we would call the United States of America. So New Amsterdam became part of the 13 colonies, but it never forgot its heritage as a leading country city, an empire city. Well, George Washington confirmed the status of New York as being something special when he declared New York the first capital of the United States, took the oath of office on Wall Street at City Hall on April 30th, 1789, and in a letter to the then governor wrote, surely this is the seat of the empire, saying that New York once again was the capital of an empire, no longer a Dutch empire on the Atlantic shores, but the capital of the new and emerging American empire. Well, this idea of New York as the capital of the empire, somehow the steering wheel on the vehicle, which was going to make its way from the Atlantic Ocean the whole way across until it got to the Pacific Ocean. And then Manifest Destiny wasn't even going to stop there. Going to war against Mexico and grabbing Texas and California, buying the Louisiana Purchase, purchasing Alaska, invading and taking over places like Hawaii, the Philippines, Wake, Guam, other colonies throughout the Pacific. Well, it was a New York journalist, John L. O'Sullivan, who coined the term manifest destiny. The destiny of the United States was manifest to all who could deny it. And it was our glorious destiny to not only fill the North American continent, sometimes even taking over Canada and the rest of Mexico, but also a destiny to spread American style capitalism, American style democracy, elections around the world. So New York played a very important role in the shaping of this new empire. Well, the idea was great, but New York needed great individuals to make the city a worthy capital of the American expanding empire. Governor DeWitt Clinton, who served as senator, mayor, and governor from 1802 to 1828, was the man who built the Empire City. He was the one responsible for City Hall, which we see in the picture on the left, which is today the same City Hall. Well, DeWitt Clinton was highly criticized for wasting so much of the city's money on such an elaborate building. And he said, mark my word, one day New York City will have a population of 1 million. It will be a rival to London, to Madrid, to Paris, and to Rome and St. Petersburg. Well, everybody still lambasted him and called him a fool, but he was intent on making New York City an empire city. He also dug the Erie Canal, which linked the Great Lakes with New York City Harbor by way of the canal and down the Hudson River. So all of the grain, all of the raw materials from the entire Great Lakes region, and Canada included, flowed to Buffalo, New York, across the canal, and down to New York City. DeWitt Clinton also came up with the grid plan, that network of north-south avenues, east-west streets, which distinguishes New York. He was the one who came up with that idea. And it wasn't just streets and avenues, but he numbered them. I mean, he said, don't waste your time on fancy names. We will just give them numbers. So no matter where you are, you just look at the signs on the street and you say, I know exactly where I'm at. I'm at 110th Street and 8th Avenue. You know exactly where you need to go. Well, another great impetus to the growth of New York City was the California Gold Rush. What were the handful of people in California going to do with all those tons of gold? Well, the tons of gold were shipped to New York City, put in Wall Street banks and investment companies, and used to build railroads, to wage wars, to build the first big skyscrapers, and even to pave the streets of New York City and many other cities. So it was DeWitt Clinton who had his vision of the Empire City. During the Civil War, who made all the money? Well, it was the robber barons of Wall Street, bankers, factory owners, insurance companies. These were the people who made a fortune. New York young men were not marching off to war to abolish slavery. They were too busy making millions. Names like Astor, names like the Vanderbilts. These were the great families that built the fantastic mansions that we see on the right, which at one time lined Fifth Avenue facing Central Park. The one on the corner is the famous Astor Mansion, the largest house ever built in New York City at the time. Well, these were the Civil War millionaires who made New York City the financial, the industrial capital of the country. Where were all the battleships for the Civil War built? The Brooklyn Naval. Who financed the raising of troops but Wall Street bankers? Who built the cannons, the uniforms? These were New York City industrialists and factory owners who made a fortune in Civil War. In fact, New York really wasn't too crazy about the war initially because New York was afraid that if the South seceded, as it did, that the owners of plantations and new plantations in places like Texas and Louisiana, who were in debt up to their ears to New York bankers, would simply say, well, we're a new country now. We don't have to pay off our debts. So initially, New York City wanted to have nothing to do with this crazy Abraham Lincoln's war. And so in 1861, Mayor Wood declared that New York City, which included Manhattan, Long Island, and Staten Island, would remain neutral during the Civil War. And he declared the city was a free city. Well, of course, Abraham Lincoln was going to have none of that. So he simply sent in the army, abolished this new idea. And in the end, New York City became a big supporter of the war, not because it supported the abolition of slavery, but because money was to be made. Following the Civil War, it was the Gilded Age. All the millionaires had built mansions. They were building factories, and New York was a rival to London, Paris, Madrid, and Rome as one of the great cities of the world. Well, not all was well in the Gilded Age. As you can see from Matthew Hale Smith's book of 1869, sunshine there was abundant in New York with the beautiful mansions. But the hundreds of thousands of immigrants and the poor people were in the shadow. And so New York was both the height of culture and elegance, but also the pits of depravity, poverty, and criminality. So New York, like every big city, was a mixed bag. On one hand, it was the Gilded Age, when everybody seemed to be rich, riding in their carriages, and the men with their top hats and the women with their big hats with feathers. And that was one chapter. Following that, there was the famous First World War, which was another age of wealth for the city. And then, of course, we all know about the Roaring Twenties. So we've had many golden ages in New York City. But we also had the other half. We see Madame Restel, who ended up becoming one of the richest women in New York City, building a glorious mansion on Fifth Avenue because she provided the prostitutes for all of the soldiers during the Civil War. To have a Restelian during the Civil War meant to have an abortion. The Gangs of New York, Herbert Asbury's famous book is phenomenal, talking about the Irish, the Jewish, the German, and later the Italian gangs. We all know about the Italian mafia gangs and the gangs today of Dominicans and Mexicans, but we tend to forget that every immigrant group had to fight its way into the fabric of New York City. The famous 5 Points area, most dangerous part in New York today. That was in Chinatown, the Lower East Side, and Little Italy, which has always been a dumping ground for poor immigrants. Hell's Kitchen, named because it was so hot with crime and murder. The Bowery, another dangerous area of the city. Here again, filled with prostitutes, Chinese gambling and opium dens, criminal gangs in the city. In the middle, you see The Gentleman's Companion, 1870. Once again, a very common booklet to be found in the lobby of every hotel, listed all of the houses of prostitution in the city so that the gentleman could go off for a night of carousing and gambling, and the women could go shopping, and the women had their guide to the fine stores of the city, while the men had their guide to the best and most popular houses of prostitution, opium dens, and gambling houses. But New York continued to grow. It attracted people like Andrew Carnegie, the richest man in the world in his high point, a Scottish immigrant who made a fortune in iron and steel in Pittsburgh, but of course built his mansion in New York. In fact, many people resented New York, describing it when they come to the city, they hear a giant sucking sound. New York is sucking all the money, the music, the art, and the talent of the whole country to its Wall Street banks, to its Fifth Avenue mansions, to its museums. And so New York was largely resented by a lot of people, but it was on its way to becoming a global capital. In fact, Thomas Cole, back in the 1830s, already predicted that New York would become another Rome, capital of another world empire. Here we see his paintings in his 5 series called The Course of Empire. Well, on the left, the big picture is his vision of the future of New York City. Well, it looks sort of Roman, but don't forget, back in the 1830s and 40s and even much later, buildings of New York, to say nothing of the buildings of Washington, D.C., were all built in the Greek and Roman style. You see the bridges, you see the ships in what Thomas Cole said would be the Hudson River with the Atlantic Ocean in the distance. Well, Thomas Cole was very realistic, and he realized that just like Rome that rose, flourished, and fell, such would be the course of the American empire. So while everybody loved Thomas Cole's picture of the future of New York City, they didn't much like the 2 paintings that followed, showing at the top New York City being destroyed by warfare and greed and corruption, and at the bottom, a ruined New York City with a tranquil Hudson River still there, New York Harbor, but the city is destroyed. So New York, already in the 1830s, was concerned with its own future. Who could imagine 100 years ago, people are talking about the destruction of New York City when, as we know, it had many more centuries of glory ahead of it. Well, New York has always been concerned with its future. Is it going to be destroyed by sin and immorality? Billy Graham came to New York back in the 1950s, preached at Madison Square Gardens for months, and he lamented that he could not convert New York City from its evil ways. Salvation Army marched up and down. Veronica Lucan, a friend of mine from Queens, predicted that if the city didn't mend its ways, it would be destroyed. Billy Graham predicted that God would destroy this Sodom and Gomorrah on the Hudson River. W.E.B. Du Bois, the great leaders of the civil rights movement back in the 1920s, wrote his famous book, The Comet, where he predicted that New York City would be destroyed because of its deeply rooted racism. Interestingly, only 2 people survive the comet that hit the city: a Black man and a white woman. Once again, having no choice but to overcome their racism. So the destruction of the city is sort of a current that goes through the city's history, just like its rise to glory. St. John the Divine, St. John the Unfinished, once again shows this 2 ways of viewing New York City. On the left, you see the World Trade Center and the Empire State Building carved into one of the capitals of the cathedral. Well, that reminds us that those 2 magnificent towers of the World Trade Center were also destroyed. Well, so far, New York City has always been able to bounce back. When it confronted a threatening future, New Yorkers always rose to the occasion. Well, 1933, the most terrible time not only for the United States, but for New York City and the world, the Great Depression. The film King Kong of 1933 shows New York City, iconic World Empire State Building, being attacked by an evil monster. Well, even in the film King Kong, New York survives, and it will become the new wonder of the world. So when New York City confronts its future, it is always with alarm, but with optimism. So how did the United States, how did New York overcome the Great Depression? Well, rather than wallowing in sadness and depression, New York built itself out of the Great Depression. On the left, the Empire State Building. When it was opened, right in the middle of the Great Depression, everybody was joking and calling it the Empty State Building because so many businesses had gone bankrupt that there was barely a light on in the building at night. Chrysler Building, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, Rockefeller Center, all built at the height of the Depression, when there was no need for big new hotels or office complexes. The city was facing ruin. But then New York once again viewed its future with optimism and said, we will build our way out of the most terrible expectations. The Reverend Norman Vincent Peale of Marble Collegiate Church, see in the middle, the descendant of the old Dutch St. Nicholas Church inside Fort Amsterdam. The worst days of the Depression took over Marble Collegiate, and his famous book, The Power of Positive Thinking, meaning New York should lead the way in showing the world not to give in to depression and suicide, but to confront the future with a positive attitude. Another great New Yorker, Robert Moses, said New York might be down, but it is not dead. He sponsored the New York World's Fair of 1939. When the world was in depression, he subtitled the World's Fair, The World of Tomorrow. He was the one who built Jones Beach, Robert Moses Park, saying, go to the beach, enjoy the outdoors. Don't give in to depression. He was the one who built Lincoln Center, the largest complex of cultural buildings on the face of the earth. On the right, he's less famous for that. That's the Cross Bronx Expressway, where he said, the future is in the seat of your automobile. So get in your car, go to Jones Beach, park your car under the giant parking lot that is below Lincoln Center. Once again, building for the future. The World's Fair, the lost world of the fair. See the future first. Futurama. Remember the future. Chrysler, General Motors. Here again, the future was something to be embraced and not feared. And this was 1939, when still another horrendous event was going to afflict the world, and that, of course, is World War II. Well, we survived World War II, and then along came the Cold War, when everybody was fearful of an atomic bomb. Well, it was interesting when people once again envisaged a world war. New York City was always presented as the prime target. Well, we know Hiroshima and Nagasaki as being the bomb in World War II site. Well, many people said that New York would be the prime target for the new atomic warfare. Collier's Magazine, 1950, showing New York City being destroyed by an atomic bomb. So people constantly viewed New York, on one sense, as a symbol of everything that is great in the United States, but also as a symbol of everything that is bad. Daily Mail, Armageddon in New York City. Again, Max Page's famous book, 2 Centuries of Fantasies, Fears, and Premonitions of New York's Destruction. Well, nobody in New York was going to give in to New York being destroyed. No matter how terrible the future might look, New York was going to lead the way of the nation and the world to overcome any dangers. Well, that didn't stop people from portraying the destruction of New York. Here we see a destroyed Brooklyn Bridge. On the right, we see New York City in flames. Here again, people were always predicting, some were even welcoming and hoping for the destruction of this evil city. But New Yorkers never gave in to fear. 1951, when worlds collide. Here again, the horror of doomsday, when other planets come to invade the Earth. Once again, when worlds collide, featured New York City. If you look at the poster on the left, you see the Empire State Building being destroyed by aliens. The aliens are not going to waste their time with Chicago or San Francisco or even Washington, D.C. They are going to go after New York City. But don't worry, New York City will confront this future the same way it always has. Planet of the Apes, again, shows the destruction of New York City. I love that final scene where you see Charlton Heston riding his horse along the beach, not knowing really where he is at until he comes upon the ruins of the Statue of Liberty. 1975, another disaster for the city. City was on the verge of economic collapse. Films like The Bronx is Burning, Blackout 77. Here again, everybody expected the city to collapse. Well, did it? Of course not. New York always builds its way out of every disastrous future prophecy. New York has been lucky. It has always managed to find the right man for the right crisis. Whether it is Theodore Roosevelt, the chief of police, Franklin D. Roosevelt, both of the Roosevelts ended up in the White House, a good New York family, the Bloomberg family, even Donald Trump from my native Queens, once again was convinced that he was going to make America great again. 1965, the World's Fair, again featuring New York City as a window into the future, Tomorrowland, and not just transforming New York City, but transforming America, and as a World's Fair, transforming the world. So New York City has always been viewed itself as in the forefront of saving the world. The Twin Towers, 1973. Again, the symbol of New York City, and not just one, but two. And where were these World Trade Centers built? Not in the outskirts of the city, but right in the heart of the old Dutch New Amsterdam. True, that wasn't part of New Amsterdam because where the World Trade Centers was built with landfill in the Hudson, but it was near the old Dutch city to show that once again, New York City is going back to its ancient Dutch self-image of New York as the Empire City. I was in New York when I watched the towers collapse. I was on the Queensboro Bridge when I watched the second tower implode. And that was a sight to see. I mean, most people were watching it on TV, but I was watching these events, taking pictures of them from the Queensboro Bridge. I spent the whole day roaming around Lower Manhattan, taking pictures, interviewing people, never thinking once for a minute that maybe I should be wearing a mask. Who knows what toxic chemicals were going around, but well, a good number of years still later, and I'm still here. But once again, how did New York City respond to the World Trade Center? And it wasn't just the World Trade Center, the symbol of New York domination of world trade, but it was also an attack on the Pentagon, the military might of the United States, And the third one was to be on the capital, the political center of power. But it was New York which suffered the most destructive consequences of this attack. So how did New York respond? Did it give in to despair as it did during the Great Depression? Or when the city was lost from the Dutch to the English, or any of the other disasters which have afflicted this city? New York City did not give in to despair. It set out once again, building its way out of despair. Brand new gleaming towers, whether it's the Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue, whether it is Hudson Yards overlooking the Hudson River, or whether it is the new World Trade Center rising on the same spot as the old World Trade Center. Build the city back bigger and better. Show the nation and the world that New York is not giving into despair and not giving in to fear. Well, the city continued to grow. In 1965, the gates of immigration were thrown open again. Were closed in 1924 following World War I and remained closed until 1965. Well, in flowed literally millions of immigrants. Picture on the left is Flushing, which became one of the largest Chinatowns outside of China. And not just Chinatown, but there's Koreatown. An entire area is Muslims from South Asia. Large numbers of Africans started flowing into Harlem, establishing Little Africa along 8th Avenue section of Harlem. Brooklyn started decorating itself with skyscrapers. So once again, New York is showing the way to greatness. It was no longer a city that was under attack, but it was a city showing the country the way into an even more glorious future. New York has always flaunted its success. When Donald Trump became great and famous, well, he did not hesitate to plaster his name on every building he built. Rockefeller Center, John D. Rockefeller Jr. did it with his Rockefeller Center. Stephen Schwarzman donated money to the New York Public Library, but you can be sure he was going to make sure his name was plastered all over the place. Tom Wolfe, in his magnificent book about Atlanta, has a comment where one of the millionaires of new rising Atlanta wanted to put his name on his building. And according to the book, Tom Wolfe said, oh, no, that's the type of thing they do in New York, but we don't do it here. So flaunt your success. New York is the Empire City, and New Yorkers want the world to know. So where are we now? Challenges of the 21st century. What is going to be the future? Are we going to remain the Empire City, or is it going to be Shanghai? Going to be Rio de Janeiro, Mexico City, or the other Mumbai megacities of the future? Well, New York faces a lot of problems. The New Yorker cover showing the results of so many different ethnic groups living together. Sure, there are all kinds of problems, race riots, attacks, problems with the police, but Who knows if New York will be able to overcome these challenges? And especially since 1965, with the Hart-Celler immigration reform, the city now is home to millions of Asians, of Africans, Middle Easterners, and the city is becoming even more diverse. People still accuse New Yorkers of being rude, but I think that is exaggerated. New York remains a major financial center for the world. And there's a good chance that in spite of the rise of the Asian giants and of new emerging countries in South America and in Africa, New York will still remain a major empire city. But still, there are a lot of fears. 1997 film Escape from New York. Again, you see New York as sort of becoming a symbol for everything that is great and everything that is bad with New York City. Crime was and remains a major issue. The Gangs of New York was released again as a modern film showing how that the city's population is afflicted by crime. So will New York be able to maintain its future? Well, this is a topic of debate. Has the Atlantic Rim lost its power? And is it the Pacific Rim that is going to be the land of the future? Artificial intelligence, once again, talking about the rise of artificial intelligence, is Steven Spielberg's book, once again showing New York City as being on the downswing. Will New York survive into the future? Global warming, once again. See the book The Day After Tomorrow, again featuring the destruction of New York by floods, by freezing. Day After Tomorrow is a wonderful scene showing the people taking refuge in the New York Public Library because it had so many books they could burn in a city where they needed fuel to protect themselves from the cold. Global warming. Kim Stanley Robinson's 2140 once again shows the destruction of the city by rising sea level. So what is the future of New York City? Is it going to be destroyed by global warming, by atomic war, overrun by robots and artificial intelligence? Is it going to be the scene of race riots and race warfare and corrupt government? Or is New York City going to reclaim its status as the American and the world empire city? Well, how does New York City respond to every challenge? How has it responded to every challenge? Well, it builds its way out of a challenge. New York City, places like Hudson Yards, Lower Manhattan, downtown Brooklyn, Long Island City, Flushing, are awash with brilliant, new, experimental, and very beautiful architecture. Every time I go to Jamaica to take the train to go to Port Washington or someplace on Long Island, the train passes through Flushing. I can go there every week, and every time I go, I will see some new spectacular spectacular building going up, filled with Chinese business people, Koreans, the streets packed with people. Hudson Yards growing in leaps and bounds. Brooklyn and Long Island City being transformed from cities of modest red brick buildings into cities with gleaming towers. So New York City is again building itself out of a grim future. Some of the proposals for buildings are absolutely phenomenal. I love the one on the left because I very often take the 7 train, which goes from near where I live in Elmhurst. It goes through Jackson Heights into the city, and just exciting architecture. I mean, I don't know if I wouldn't call it beautiful, but I'll tell you, it is very, very futuristic. And so New York, even Daniel Doctorow wrote, greater than ever, New York big comeback. The latest fad are what we call these little pencil towers, which look so delicate, so fragile. You think that a little breeze would knock them over, but they are going up all over the city. So you can have an apartment with windows on all 4 sides. And you see the rising sun over the Atlantic, the setting sun over the rest of the country, and live in phenomenal style. So once again, New York is building its way out of another crisis. Well, it's building itself in many new ways. It is what New York is well aware that the future is not going to be just the 5 boroughs of New York City, but New York City is literally the empire city for an empire that goes from southern Maine the whole way down to Virginia. This is often referred to as the Northeast megalopolis, or the megacity. 9/11 convinced many New Yorkers that you shouldn't concentrate everything in one small area. Shortly after 9/11, the big banks started building satellite campuses in Long Island, up in Connecticut, in eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, so that if there should be another disaster in New York City, the banks wouldn't have to shut down. This decentralization of New York City was accelerated as a result of COVID-19, when many people simply refused, could not, or were not allowed to commute from Long Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania to downtown New York City. So factories, universities, banks, insurance companies, industries started building a decentralized system. So if the Chase Bank found that it had 100 workers who lived in an area of Long Island, they would just rent office space periodically for a meeting of all of these executives, and they would be plugged in by Zoom and other modern technology with their colleagues all over the place. So New York is, as I speak, rapidly decentralizing, spreading out its main industries in this giant area from southern Maine down to Virginia. Campuses are being decentralized. Columbia, Touro University, where I teach, are now realizing they don't have to have all the students come into one centralized campus or even into a classroom at all. Teaching on Zoom, teaching in other decentralized ways. So many people say that the age of Wall Street is over, the age of Metropolitan Museum, Metropolitan Opera, Columbia, NYU universities, their age of centralization are over, where art exhibits from the Metropolitan will no longer be restricted to the Metropolitan, but they will be scattered around the greater megalopolis area of New York. And we are seeing this happening even on a global scale, where NYU has campuses all over the world. Metropolitan is building branches of its museums in the Middle East and in South America. Singers and performers from the Metropolitan Opera and Philharmonic Orchestra now go on tour. So there's no need to centralize culture at Lincoln Center or at a university campus. So New York is literally expanding and is going to be the New York megalopolis from southern Maine to Virginia. And so this is going to be not just the future of New York City, but other megacities. The megacity of San Francisco down to Los Angeles on the Pacific coast is also filling in between the cities with smaller cities, branches of universities, industries, and leaving behind the concentration of population and services in one very small area. In this day and age, everything is becoming global. Universities, Metropolitan Museum and Opera, NYU, Bloomberg Corporation, Wall Street Journal, New York Times. These are no longer concentrated in one small area. You can read the New York Times and Wall Street Journal online. You don't even have a paper copy anymore. And so you're having a rapid globalization of everything. Here again, this is because of modern technology, which is now allowing New York City to become a New York megalopolis. In fact, many people say that the East Coast cities from southern Maine down to Virginia could very often secede from the United States and become a country in their own right. What does Washington know about the problems of a megalopolis on the West Coast? Maybe California, megalopolis area, could secede from the United States and become a country in its own right. So New York City is facing a glorious future. We see the mega city on the right, going the whole way down the coast, even up to into Canada. Peter Salines wrote New York Unbounded, talking about the city and the politics, to say nothing of the economics, the culture of the future. New York will triumph in the future. It is now in rapid transition. In fact, I do so much of my work from home that I rarely use the subway. Whereas before COVID and 9/11, I was living on the subway, dashing from place to place. I don't have to go to the library. I search different libraries for a book. I order them online, and I just stop by and pick up enough movies and books to last me a week. So New York City will no longer remain a city. It will be a mega city or the New York City megalopolis. Well, I have been fascinated by not just the future of New York City, but the future of all major cities. On the right, you see me at the Burj Khalifa tower, the tallest building in the world in Dubai. And that is very much the city of the future. Floating population, people in and out, part of the booming Persian Gulf, ultra modern cities. So the New York of the future is going to be an exciting place. The transition from New York City to New York megalopolis will no doubt be difficult. There will be challenges, but the Empire City has always risen to the challenge, and it will always remain New York, the world's Empire City. So, thank you very much for joining me. I hope to see you sometime in the future for another exciting lecture with your favorite speaker, Dr. Ronald J. Brown. So, thank you very much for joining me today, and I will see you again.